Welcome back to Think Design Works Smart. I'm Alex Bolboaca and I'm coming at you from the Mozaic Works studios, and what I have for you today is a new kind of video that we're trying out, which is an explainer. And the topic of the explainer today is validating email addresses. We will answer 3 different questions. The first question is, why do we need to validate email addresses? The second one is steps. What steps do we need to take when we validate email addresses? And the third is tips for validating email addresses correctly. This all started from a question by Einar Host. I hope this is the right way to pronounce his name. Why do we do regular expression checks on email addresses? And my answer was, I understand the need of developers to simplify things and to eliminate various steps that seem superfluous, but in this case, there is a big problem that we will see. Email address validation is required for security issues. We can introduce vulnerabilities like SMTP injection, but not only. If we don't validate or at least don't sanitize the email addresses. But the question was, why do we do regular expression checks on email addresses? And I don't think we necessarily need regular expressions for email addresses. In fact, I would prefer another way, typically a specialized library. But let's go into more details and understand what this is about. So when we validate an email address, we have 3 problems that we want to solve. First, does the email address have a valid format? Second, is it an acceptable email address? In other words, is it an email address that you would like to have as part of your system? And we'll see that there are a few categories that maybe you don't. Third, does the email address actually exist? Now, there is one problem that we are not solving with validation of email addresses, and that is, does that email address actually is owned by the person who has created the account? That is a completely different question and much more difficult, and particularly in banking systems or insurance or things like that, you need additional validations to verify the actual person that is behind that email address. Right? Just because an email address is called johndoe@test.com, it doesn't mean that the person is John Doe. Okay. All right. So let's look at the first one. Does the email address have a valid format? Well, what is the valid format for emails? The valid format for email addresses is standardized so it was initially standardized in the 1980s and updated through RFCs 5322 and 6854. This sounds already very boring, I'm pretty sure. What makes it even more difficult is if you try to read this, they don't talk in usual terms that we are used to. They talk about, so when we talk about email address, we're just talking about the ADDR-spec in section 3.4 of RFC 5322. The RFC defines address more broadly as either a mailbox or group. A mailbox value can be either a name address, which contains a display name, address spec, or more commonly address spec alone. I'm pretty sure this has become quite boring. And if you look at the 3.4 section in the corresponding RFC, what you see is a lot of things that looks like legalese. All right. Reading RFC is an art in itself. It's a skill in itself. I don't master the skill. And in case you are one of the people who are reading or even writing RFCs, I don't know how you do it. I'd like to talk to you some more. But the important thing is it's complicated. So the valid format is formed by a local part in the domain. They are separated by the symbol @ Although the standard requires the local part to be case sensitive, it also urges the receiving host deliver messages in a case independent manner. So there is a standard, but not everybody, but it's not a fixed standard, right? So there are a lot of options with this. But it's even more interesting to see some email addresses. And I have a quiz for you. Which of the following do you think are valid email addresses? Or which of the following are invalid, if you prefer? So you have a few examples. johndoe@test.com. This is obviously valid. john.doe@test.com, obviously valid as well. And by the way, the dot symbol has a special meaning in email addresses. Google, for example, completely ignores the dot. So yeah, the email addresses are equivalent. John.doe and John Doe, well, they are equivalent. Then another one which is interesting, john.doe plus tdws@test.com. This is actually an email address that is equivalent with john.doe@test.com, but you can filter by it. So it's a way to, in case you are signing up to various sites, it's a way to monitor where do you get the emails. So who got your email from where, right? Because if you sign up to, I don't know, a site like, let's say, example.com with john.doe plus example@test.com, and then you receive emails on john.doe plus example, then you know that if that email is coming from example.com, then it's fine. But if it's coming from somewhere else, you know they either have sold your address or it has been leaked. So it's a way of dealing with it. No, of course, it's not 100% way of dealing with it, but well, it's a way. What do you think about the next ones? The next ones contain characters, slashes, dots, and double slashes, quotes, equal signs, $sign, exclamation mark, %, underscore. Are these valid email addresses? Well, turns out all of these are valid email addresses. So now the question is, how do you validate something like this? The format. And this doesn't take into account the domain names, which can be Unicode. So you could have a lot of different special characters in the domain name part. So all of these email addresses are valid. Then the next question is, how do you validate with a regular expression? This is the first thing that you would try. And in Perl, you have this monster of regular expression, which is 4,312 characters that validates an email address. Now, the other option, there are other options, obviously. There's the OASP, recommend irregular expression, which is just 76 characters. But the question is, do these include all the combinations that you would like to have? Because you might block some users or some user categories that you'd like to have in your system. So it's up to you, actually, how you validate. And this is just the format. We'll discuss how to validate the format. I will give you some tips in the end, some thoughts on how to deal with this. Let's talk about the second problem. The second problem is this an acceptable email address? And here you have other questions that you need to ask. Does the domain exist? Is this actually a valid domain? Or is this just an email address with some weird domain? Maybe just introduced as a exploit attempt. Is this a disposable email address? maybe you accept disposable email addresses, maybe you don't want to accept them. If you don't want to accept them, then you might need to block some of these domains. Is the domain used for things like spam, scam, or phishing? Do you use a blacklist for this? Is this an attempt to exploit your system? So for example, on some of our websites, we have users who register from time to time with some weird addresses, and they just register. They don't have any privileges, any permissions, but it's an attempt to exploit in a way. So imagine, for example, that you are sending emails to all the users in your system, and you don't separate between those who have certain roles and those who don't, because you make a mistake and you send to all the registered users, even to users who have registered without having any specific permissions, and you send some information that should only be available to registered users or to actually active users. Might not be a problem. It might be a problem, or it might be a problem if you are sending by mistake mass emails to more users than you'd like to, and it contains some information, and you leak some information to users who are, well, to email addresses of users who are not supposed to get this information, right? Because let's not forget, mistakes can happen. And it's good to protect yourself against such things. So these are questions that you need to ask if you want to accept these types of email addresses. Now, the final question in validating emails is, does this email address actually exist? This is the simplest one to solve, because you just send an email with a validation link, you verify the email, and so on. This is an example from IKEA family, but you are very familiar with these types of examples. Now, what is the problem if you are just sending the email directly? Well, the problem is with security. You are opening up your system to various exploits and potential attacks. One of them is SMTP injection. No matter what you are using, eventually your email will end up as a SMTP string. So imagine that you have a form where a user can, like a feedback form where a user can enter an email address, subject, and a message, a very common contact form. And then you are sending that email to somebody in the organization because you want them to know that a new message was posted. This is what you end up with. This is SMTP. You have a header part, mail from johndoe@test.com. Then you have a data part, and then you have the various strings from johndoe@test.com to test@yourorganization.com, subject, something to say, and then the body, great work, and then it ends. Cool. Now, what if your user introduces in the form a new line, /r/n bcc everyone@yourorg.com. What happens is that this line, this new line in your SMTP package will end up as a BCC address. And now you are sending email to everybody in your organization, assuming that everyone@yourorg.com is a valid group email. But attackers don't have to be right all the time. They can just try out various strings, and eventually if something happens, then great. And then you send an email like, buy this product, it's a great product, and it's a scam thing, but it's sent from a valid email address in your account, so it's not blocked as spam. It might be blocked as something else. by if you have more advanced filters. Now, this is an example when you are sending this email to somebody who, well, inside your organization. But what if you are sending, doing the BCC towards somebody outside your organization, like a client, right? And you say to a client, look, this is a great product. It's one of our products. It's a URL that looks like a URL from your website, but then when you click on it, it actually goes to another website. No, your user introduces email and password from your website there, and now you are having a full-fledged attack on that user. And this would be, of course, a phishing type of attack. So it's important to understand that this can happen. Now, shouldn't the SMTP library that you are using, or server, or whatever it is, take care of this? Of course, it should. But this doesn't absolve you from actually validating, or at least sanitizing the email address, because what you have here is you need to follow two, well, there was one principle, and nowadays it's the extension of this principle in security. The initial principle, defense in depth, so have multiple layers of defense. If the SMTP library takes care of this, great, but it doesn't, it's not bad to actually sanitize or validate the email a second time, because you can block it earlier. And if you block it earlier, let's imagine the following scenario. You're using an SMTP library today. You get an email address, you store it in your system. It's one of these email addresses that is handcrafted to be an exploit, an attack vector, and then you you try to send an email, maybe it's blocked, that's good. But then you change your SMTP library, or you change the server or the way you send emails. And now you are having a vulnerability, because maybe the new system doesn't work the same as the previous one, and you are trying to resend the email, and you have an issue now. And this is why we need things like defense in depth. We need to validate multiple times and sanitize multiple times. The newer version of this is called Zero Trust Security. Basically, you don't trust anything that you get from the rest of the world, and you sanitize everything. And this is a good principle to follow, particularly in the world of distributed applications, where you have separate microservices or components or that are doing their own thing, and they need to validate each other, because how do you know that the service calling you is not an exploited service in some way? So because of this, the only way to deal with security is to go to zero trust, to assume not to trust any of the services that is calling you, and sanitize everything. And this implies a few things. It implies identification, authorization, but also sanitization. By the way, the same principles apply to external services like AWS, SaaS, or whatever you are using for sending emails. Maybe they are not vulnerable to this simple example of SMTP injection, but they might be vulnerable to other types of injection attacks, or server-side request forgery, or other types of attacks. So you need to be very careful, even if you are using an external service. And the best policy in terms of security is to sanitize everything. Don't trust the user input, don't trust the input from other systems, even if they are built by inside your organization as well. Always sanitize. So in this situation, you would have multiple layers of validation. Okay. Good. So what can we do? It's time for the tips to solve this problem. Well, first of all, how do we validate the email address format? Well, you have a few options. You can limit the characters you allow in the email addresses. The issue with that is that you might limit your user base. For example, if you are eliminating pluses, some users might not be happy with it, might not sign up. It's up to you. So it's a decision, but it's a decision that is not only technical in nature, but it affects the business. So be careful. You could use a third-party library or a standard library for validation. And in that way, you trust that library to validate multiple things, all the things that we discussed about. Sometimes they are checking the DNS records, they might be checking blacklists for spam or scam or things like that. And yeah, it's perhaps a good way, and it's the one that I prefer, to delegate this to a library that is trusted, that is reviewed, that is open, ideally. To separate another thing you could do is separate the local part from the domain part and validate them separately. This is much easier than validating the whole email address because you can then make a number of checks. And I wouldn't go necessarily to use a regular expression, as I said. Maybe you can just use code to validate. By the way, you need to, if you are doing web applications, validate both on client and on server. It's not enough to validate on client because any user can post to your website, right? So this will go around the client-side validation, and if you don't have a server-side validation, it's already a problem. Another option would be to sanitize the email address. So instead of checking that it's a valid email address, they are checked that, for example, it doesn't have /r/n or any other weird characters like this. Now, in order to do that, you will need a list of characters to look for. I'm not sure there is one. Maybe there is one on OWASP. And yeah, perhaps it's a good option. Of course, one of the options is to use web application firewall. These are tools that monitor all the HTTP requests, and they sanitize or block requests for you. It doesn't mean that they can block everything, but they might block some of the most, obvious potential problems. Okay, how do we block unwanted domains? Well, we have domain blacklists or third-party validation. So we could use an external service that does these checks for us, or some kind of library with a blacklist that knows how to check things. Third, does the email exist? This is the simplest one. You send an email with a validation link. If that link is clicked, you know that the email exists. This does not identify the person, right? So it doesn't mean that John Doe has actually created an account on your website if using the email address johndoe@gmail.com. It just means that somebody did, right? And what you know is the email address. You don't really know if that is a person. That might not be important in your context. You need to pay attention to this sometimes. In conclusion, email is complicated, right? There is no single solution, and it depends a lot on what you are trying to do. And I believe that the easiest way, but the way that it involves costs, might involve costs, is to use an external library or service to validate these things. And one that I've used in the past is the Apache Commons Validator for Java that contains an implementation for validating email. And I don't remember exactly all the details, but I think part of it was validating blacklists and other things like this. So this is my recommendation. It doesn't mean that it fits all the possible products, all the possible contexts. I'd invite you to, think for yourself, figure out what is important in your context. If you are just starting up, maybe with a product, maybe you don't care so much about this, although scammers and spammers will appear quite soon based on my experience in the past. So yeah, it's up to you. So I think you need to take this into account and decide for yourself. So what do you think about all this? Does this make sense? Is this something that you think about? Have you seen issues with emails? Have you been on the receiving side of an email-based attack on your products that you are working with? Or do you feel that you have the perfect way to validate emails and you'd like to share it with us? Let us know in the comments. My conclusion is only one, and that is email is complicated because every time we have an intersection between technology and people, we get complicated things. It's the same with datetime, with time zones, with internationalization and localization. These are all complex things, and email address is same. It's a standard that has evolved gradually and organically from certain expectations of people, and because of this it's quite complicated. So my conclusion, email is complicated, and the only advice I can give you is remember to think, design, and work smart.